don't see anybody wandering late, I'll go ahead and start. I'll maybe give you a little chance to browse the store or whatever afterwards. So thank you for coming. Tonight we're going to talk about invasive plants. Those of you that attended some of my talks at Country Max earlier, I guess talking about pollinators and nice plants. This is my, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing. This is my bad plant talk. So back in July of 2014, New York State issued regulations that prohibited possession, transport, etc. of invasive species. That led to a lot of people calling Cornell and saying, what does all that mean? So tonight we're going to talk about what is an invasive species, what's the history of regulations, and what invasive plants are we likely to find in our gardens. The list is much bigger than that, but I'll talk about ones that you're likely to stumble across, and then what should you do about it? So a dictionary or a USDA definition of invasive species means it's a species that's non-native to the ecosystem under consideration, and it's going to cause or is causing harm. I underlined 3 clauses in there, and all 3 are important. And dry definitions like this are hard to understand. So instead of just trying to explain the words, I'm going to use a series of examples to illustrate it. So let's start with garlic mustard. Garlic mustard was introduced to the US from Europe for both culinary and medicinal purposes back in the 1860s, so over 100 years ago. In Europe, its native ecosystem, there's over 30 insects and several herbivores that keep it under control. So it's not a problem in Europe. In North America, it has no predators. There's no insect predators, and our deer just don't like it. The deer they eat everything else, but they don't like this. It spreads really rapidly. It displaces native understory species like bloodroot and trillium, etc. I'm going to talk a little more about it later, but it has a nasty trait. It's called what's called allelopathic. This is a fancy word meaning it emits poisons from its roots that poison other plants around it. So in addition to seeding like crazy, it puts these poison out through the roots that basically kills things around it, spreads rapidly. I gave this talk last week to another group, and somebody's commenting, oh, that explains what happened to the trillium in my woodland garden. Because she had trillium in a woodland garden, the garlic mustard got in there, and she says, I haven't seen the trillium for the last couple of years. Well, yes, the garlic mustard probably poisoned it. So it's really causing problems in national parks and all sorts of places. So this meets all 3 criteria for being an invasive species. It's not native. It's not native to the New York ecosystems we're talking about, and it's causing harm. So it hits all 3 of the things that I underlined in that list. That makes it an invasive plant. So let's try a different one. Let's try poison ivy. Poison ivy, of course, causes an itching, irritating rash if you touch it. I know from personal experience, many of you probably do as well. Highly sensitive people can get serious symptoms that might even require medical attention. So it clearly causes harm, but it's a native plant in New York. So as soon as I say that, we can't call it invasive. So as soon as I say it's native, we can't use the invasive word. We can use all the profanity that we know, and we can call it bad things, but we can't call it native. So I did this talk for our new master gardeners, and it's kind of a vocabulary thing. Let's take common milkweed. It's very aggressive. It'll take over your whole garden. You can call it a garden thug. You can call it aggressive, but the word you shouldn't use is invasive. Basically, we should never use the word native and invasive together. So we reserve the word invasive for the ones that aren't native. Let's try a third example. Let's talk about nasturtiums. So nasturtiums aren't native. They're native to the Andes from Bolivia to Colombia. They're a very common garden annual. I bet if we went and looked out in the seeds here in Country Max, they would have seed packets for nasturtiums. And when they get their annuals in for sale, they might even have nasturtium for sale because it's a lovely garden plant. The blossoms are edible. So clearly here in upstate New York, nasturtiums are not invasive. But if we went to Hawaii or Lord Howe Island or New Zealand or the Galapagos, it is regulated as invasive. It may soon be declared invasive in coastal California, where if you go to coastal California, you'll see large swaths of nasturtiums going through all the native vegetation. So this is where, we're fine here. It's not fine in California. So if, basically all invasive species lists are local. Our list will be different than a list anyplace else. So if you're comparing notes with a friend, let's say in the South, they'll talk about kudzu, right? They'll talk about all the problems kudzu is causing in the South. Doesn't cause a problem up here. Or we're talking just about plants tonight. If we talk about animals and go down to Florida, we'll talk about those Burmese pythons in the Everglades, right? That's an invasive animal. Not up here, fortunately. It's very much a local thing that our list will be different than anybody else's list. And I mentioned that, we're going to talk about invasive plants tonight, and most will be from Asia and Europe, and people are going, all those bad foreign plants. Well, if I went over to Europe, I'd have to talk about some of the bad American plants that are invasive in Europe. Some of our lovely goldenrods that we love to grow for pollinators and stuff are invasive in Europe. So it's always a local thing. There certainly is a common thing here. We move these plants around, or we move these animals around, and we get away with that 99% of the time. Think of all the different non-native plants we have in our gardens, all the non-native annuals and stuff. That works just fine. 1% of the time, we get the disasters we'll talk about tonight. So let's talk about another example. This one, cup plant, is a very lovely prairie plant native to the Midwest, including Ohio, so it's native fairly close to here. In the state of Michigan, it's even threatened. It's a plant that, because of agricultural practices and other things, is in trouble. Here in New York, it's invasive. Wouldn't really be a problem probably here in Monroe County, but up in the Adirondacks and on into New England, it's causing severe environmental harm. So here we have this environmental species. It's invasive only a few hundred miles from home. It didn't have to move very far before it became invasive, and it's endangered in its home environment and invasive here. That's not uncommon. In its home environment, it may be other invasive species causing problems or human behavior, and then you move it a few hundred miles or a few thousand miles and it becomes invasive. So again, it gets to things, this is all very local. Where a plant is invasive depends on where it is. So those are my examples. I'll just pause, and hopefully the term invasive species makes sense and what it is. It's okay, good. So I'm just going to give a brief history to regulations, saying that actually in 2003 under Governor Pataki that the legislation was signed to establish the task force. They didn't finish their work until 2014. I don't put that up to criticize. I put that up to point out that a lot of science and a lot of research went into this. This was a very well-studied, well-established list. This wasn't a rush job. This wasn't something hacked together in the middle of the night. They had a task force that spent years developing criteria and studying this very closely. I've looked at lists from adjacent states and kind of like in New England or down in Pennsylvania. There's really, it makes sense. It's very consistent geographically. So there was a lot of work put into this. As I said, we're just doing plants tonight. The list includes algae, fungi, fish, invertebrates, animals, and things like the feral hogs, or like the zebra mussel. It includes a whole range of things. So I'm not going to get into their criteria in detail, but they had a whole spreadsheet. For every species I talk about tonight, you can actually go online and find a spreadsheet and a detailed scoring. But they looked at the ecological impact, they looked at its characteristics, they looked at how distributed it was, they looked at how hard it was to control. They had sub-criteria for each one of those. Then they put together a score on a 0 to 100 scale. And if it was above 70, it's highly invasive. If it's above 80, considered very highly invasive. So basically, they scored the plants. They had to score above 70 to make it on the list. We talk about ecosystems. New York State is not one ecosystem. Our climate is different than the Long Island, for example. So actually, they divided New York State into 8 different ecosystems for looking at invasive species. And the rule they made is if it's invasive in any one of these ecosystems, it's banned statewide. It's just too complicated to say, you can grow it in your Finger Lakes garden, but you can't take it up to your cabin in the Adirondacks. That would just make a nightmare of enforcement. So there are plants certainly on the list that are not invasive here in Monroe County, but they're banned on a statewide basis because it's too complex to manage any other way. I will mention each one of these regions has something called a PRISM. That's Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. So you can go to the Finger Lakes PRISM for our region and get information on managing the invasive species that are particular problems here in the Finger Lakes. I'm not going to get into this legalese. I'm tempted to take the slide out when I revise the talk next year. Prohibited are the worst of the invasives. You're not allowed to sell them, do anything. You can actually still sell a regulated species. You just have to warn people that they shouldn't let it be introduced into the environment. So in theory, you could grow it in an isolated place. But the legalese says, I think I'm going to pull that slide at some point. Let's start with weeds. These are going to be plants that you're going to find in your garden that you didn't put there deliberately and you don't want. So these are all, and I'll walk through these one at a time. But these are plants that if we get in the spring, you start working in your garden. Some of them are up already, some will be appearing soon, but they're all the things that we would consider weeds. Pale and black swallowwort, was introduced from Europe way back in the 1800s as an ornamental. It quickly escaped gardens, so they realized they were in trouble in a hurry. It's become more of a problem lately because as some pasture land and farmland gets abandoned, it really takes over that area and gets large reservoirs there. It can vine up through trees. It starts just as a low plant, but you can find it vining, but by the end of the summer above your head in trees. It actually causes commercial damage to Christmas tree farms because when it vines up through the Christmas trees, it can distort the branches and do things that cause the tree to be one that you wouldn't want to cut when you're at that farm. The biggest problem for an environment is displacing milkweed. Swallowwort is not in the milkweed family, but it's a cousin that's in the same grouping genetically. It displaces milkweed habitat because it's also allelopathic, poisoning through the soil. And when it displaces the milkweed, there's nothing for the monarchs to lay their eggs on. Because if monarchs get fooled by this and lay their eggs on it, the caterpillars die and don't develop. So this one is really causing a problem for monarch habitat as well as for the Christmas tree farms and things. So if you find this in your garden, this is one that you can try mechanical removal if you got just a little plant, but if you leave the smallest piece of root in the ground, it will resprout. So this one you want to catch early. You certainly don't want it to go to seed. You don't want the seed pods going around, but you want to catch it early. If it's really only a single plant, you might be able to dig it, but I'd keep an eye watching that area. I would kind of note where that area in the garden is and go back repeatedly and next spring and everything to make sure it's not coming back. And you might need chemical control in some cases because it's a tough one. I'll mention they are working on trying to develop biological controls for this one. Just a word on biological controls, that is actually a very challenging thing to achieve. They have to go to its home, home country where it came from. So this came from Europe. They have to go to Europe and find an insect that preys on it or eats on it in Europe. And that may not be known because if it's a well-behaved plant in its home ecosystem, no one may have studied what pests are eating it. Then they have to bring that insect back here, make sure it will survive our weather, survive our winters and stuff. And then most importantly, they have to do a lot of studies to make sure the only thing it eats is swallowwort. Because the last thing they want to do is let it out and have her discover that maybe it likes our native plants even better. So they have to do a lot of challenge studies to make sure that if there's no swallowwort, that organism will die. It takes years and years of research. They're working on it, but it will take time. So I mentioned garlic mustard, as I said, it was imported in the late 1800s. I'll just add it as a prolific seeder. If it flowers like that and goes to seed, a single plant can produce 500 or more seeds, and the seeds can live in the ground for up to 5 years. So if your garlic mustard goes to seed and you don't catch it all, you'll be watching for seedlings for 5 years because it'll take that long for the seed bank to exhaust itself. The good thing I can say about garlic mustard, it has very shallow roots. This one is extremely easy to go in a garden and simply pull out. It is starting to come up. I was up at Durand Eastman Park on Tuesday and saw it in several places. So this is one to start watching for now. It has a kind of a light green garlic, mustard type foliage or mustard type foliage, very, cut leaves. So it's pretty easy to spot in the garden. When I go out, because I often have some on the lot line with my neighbor behind me. So I'll weed his yard for him too. If it hasn't gone to seed yet, I just pull it and drop it because it'll just compost into the soil. If it's gone to seed, I pull it, put it in a bucket, and put it in my trash toter. But a lot of times if you're out now, it's definitely not flowering yet. So you could definitely go out and pull it now if you wanted to. So definitely in a home garden, you can eradicate this. You can keep pulling it till you exhaust the seed bank, and then as long as you don't get any new coming in, you can eradicate this in a home garden without a lot of trouble. In the wild where it spreads like crazy, it's very hard to control. Yes, in fact, when it's young, before it flowers, apparently some people like it for salads and things. That's why it was imported. That's why people brought it over here. I was working at the Master Garden plant sale probably a decade ago, and somebody came in and wanted to know why we weren't selling garlic mustard because she really liked it for her salads and wanted to know why we weren't selling it. Japanese knotweed. This one was introduced from Asia as an ornamental late 1800s. By the 1930s, people realized it was invasive. I point out there's a person there, and the knotweed is over the top of his head. This one gets quite big. It spreads through rhizomes on the ground. This is another one. You can try digging it very hard because the smallest piece of root left will resprout. So you can certainly try to dig the entire root mass. You may have to use chemical controls. I don't have this one in my garden, but I've seen this one. If you're driving north on Clover, heading toward Monroe, before you get to the plaza where the bagel store stuff, by midsummer, there's usually a very large swath on the right-hand side, flowering and everything, just before you get to that plaza there. It's kind of between the neighbor's lawn and where the plaza starts. There's usually a large swath of Japanese knotweed by midsummer in that area. So it's definitely around. There used to be some on the edge of Highland Park, so it's definitely in the county. Oriental Bittersweet was one introduced from Asia in the 1860s as an ornamental. People used to like taking these thin vines, especially when you have it's a yellow flower with orange berries. It's extremely attractive, making wreaths and things to sell it to people and put on, hanging for decoration. This has, by the way, a score of 87 on that list of 0 to 100. The big problem with this one is a tree killer. When it wraps around a tree like this, is this little tiny vine. It looks very pretty, but it keeps getting thicker and thicker until it chokes out the cambium layer of the tree. Remember, the living layer of a tree is just under the bark, and when it chokes it out, the tree dies. We fight this at Durand Eastman Park all the time. There's a group of volunteers working there every Tuesday. I've used my saw to cut through Oriental Bittersweet vines that were 6 inches in diameter. It just keeps growing, and the tree was long dead. We wanted to get the vine out so it would stop putting out seeds. So this one, if you find it in your yard starting to wind up a tree, it'll be very easy to pull. When it's that small, it'll pull right up. That'll be the end of it. And you certainly want to do that before it kills any trees in your yard. In terms of, people worry, is that vine poison ivy or is it bittersweet? The simple advice I give you, if the vine is winding around a tree like that, it's either Oriental Bittersweet or our native grape. The native grape is still a problem because it can still kill your tree. If it's going straight up the tree, it's poison ivy or it's Virginia creeper. Virginia creeper is actually a nice native, I believe it. But in my view, if it's going straight up the tree, I'm not touching it because I've caught poison ivy too many times. Common buckthorn is a bush introduced in the 1880s as a hedge plant. Can even go up to 20 foot as a small tree. It has these lovely kind of blue-black berries in the late summer. I would swear that every single one of them germinates. So the birds like the seeds. They eat the seeds and they sit on a power wire or whatever and drop seeds everywhere. On my neighbor's side of the back lot line, I've got a whole row of buckthorn growing that got dropped by birds. The stuff on my side of the lot line is gone. On his side, he doesn't really want to take it out. I prune it for him, but he doesn't want to take it out. This will displace native plants as well. This, if you walk the Erie Canal Trail, like between Clover and Edgewood, you'll find this along the Erie Canal in spades. Just huge rows of buckthorn growing along the Erie Canal or along other areas. It's a bush. It spreads by these birds. It really is displacing native plants. Now, in your home garden, it's a small bush. Cut it off at the ground, make sure it doesn't resprout. You're done with it. If you want, you can try and dig it. Home control is pretty easy. You get into our parks and things where you got massive amounts of it, you're going to need a chainsaw or a bulldozer or something to take it out because it's huge. I should mention, when I say the birds eat the berries and deposit the seeds, people say, well, gee, if the birds are eating the berries, it must be okay, right? Because our local birds are eating it. There's an interesting bunch of research being done in RIT by a biologist. And what she's collecting berries from native plants and invasives, and she's studying their nutritional content. So she's basically doing nutrition labeling for birds. What's the percentage of carbohydrates, fat, sugar, etc. The native berries are much higher in fats and protein and the things the birds need to fatten up for migrations. The invasives tend to be junk food, high in sugar and not much else. So, then she says the obvious question she gets is, why are the birds eating it? Well, for two reasons. She points out we eat junk food too, but also if it's displaced all the native bushes, there's nothing else for the birds to eat. But it is not good. It's impacting probably our bird numbers and our health and things because it doesn't give the nutrients they need for migrating or successfully overwintering. Multiflora Rose is another shrub. It was introduced from Asia in 1866 as rootstock for grafted roses, also for erosion control. And it quickly became invasive. It's another one that spreads very aggressively. It'll climb up, this one can climb several feet up through trees. The yellow flowers, it is a rose, but not that attractive. Again, you can use mechanical removal. The Celastrus is being a rose, it's covered in thorns. So this is one in the group I work with at Durand. We deal with it in the wintertime when we're wearing our heavy coats and gloves and things, not in the summer. Again, in the home garden, if you had it, cut the bush and you'd be done. Lesser celandine is one I just saw when I was walking the dog this afternoon. It's blooming right now, so if you see something that's blooming in your yard, that's probably Lesser celandine. It was native to Europe, North Africa, Western Asia. It was brought here as a garden ornamental in 1860s because it is certainly a pretty spring flower. Quickly escaped from gardens. Its preference would be for moist, sandy soil. I saw it growing in good clay soil in Brighton this afternoon, so I think it'll grow almost anywhere. It's a spring ephemeral, so it'll be around for a while in the spring and then disappear, but it displaces all the native spring ephemerals. So it's another one that you'll go after the native spring ephemerals. If you have a very small amount, you might be able to get it out mechanically. But again, you leave the smallest piece of root around, it'll come back. The recommended control is use chemicals of some type, some sort of herbicide. The trick is the way this plant wins. It's not poison. It's not allelopathic. It's not poisoning natives. It's winning by coming up first. This is the first thing up in the spring. So the recommendation is either you mark it with stakes, you take lots of pictures with your cell phone, and then it's probably too late this spring because I think the trilliums and stuff are starting to come up. But next spring, having taken your pictures and knowing where it is, basically the minute it comes up, you hit it with Roundup or some sort of herbicide that's short-lived. It'll kill the celandine. By the time the good stuff comes up, the herbicide's gone. And so it's very much a timing thing. Get it before the other stuff starts to come up. I think with all the 70-degree days we had last week and stuff, it's too late for this year. But certainly I walked by somebody's yard in my neighborhood, and the celandine is probably taking over about half the grass in his lawn. Common reedgrass, Phragmites. This is an accidental introduction. Came in from ship ballast in the late 1800s or early 1900s. This one has a severe impact on wetlands, displacing cattails and things. If you go to Tinker Park and hike some of the trails in Tinker Park, I see somebody that you must hike those trails. Huge amount of Phragmites. There's a big amount of Phragmites in front of the main post office on Jefferson. And yet pretty much any wetland along interstates or highways, you'll see the Phragmites is really taking over and displacing the cattails. So all the native birds and things that were dependent on cattails are losing their habitat as the Phragmites takes over. This is a hard one. Mechanical removal in a wetland, of course, is very challenging. In theory, fire works, but you have to get hot enough to cook the roots. You're not going to get that hot in a wetland unless it's dry for part of the year. So it's probably going to have to be chemical controls, but chemical controls, there's a lot of chemicals you can't use around a wetland. So this one, there's some advice on the PRISM website, but this is a real tricky one. They are working on a biological control, but it's not ready yet. But currently, if you look at our wetlands around Monroe County, this is probably the invasive I see the most driving in my car. You know, in terms of the one I see the most driving at 30 miles an hour, this would be it. I see this one pretty much any place the soil is slightly wet or any ditch or anything. Purple loosestrife used to be an invasive we talked about all the time, right? It was about 10, 15 years ago. Again, introduced both deliberately and via ship ballast as early as 1930s. It prefers wetlands, grows lots of places, was really displacing a lot of native plants and was aggressively spreading. And then they released a biological control. This one, they found a biological control, released it probably 5, 6, at least 7 years ago. And it's still out there, but you can really see the difference that biological control means. This one, you see it, but it's not the crazy amounts we used to see. And that's, the biological control will never completely eradicate it, because if it's gone, the control dies and then it comes back. But basically, it means that it has competition just like our native plants do. And now they're on an equal footing and they can compete more fairly. So this one gives you an example. It's still banned. You still wouldn't want it in your yard. You want to get rid of it. But it's not the problem it used to be because of the biological control that's out there. Then one last one that I've never seen, hope I never do. Giant hogweed was introduced from the Caucasus in the late 1800s as an ornamental. One of the first locations actually was Highland Park here in Rochester. It was also introduced because beekeepers loved it because it was an abundant nectar producer that the bees really like. This is much more of a human health threat than an environmental threat, because if you see this, you do not want to touch it. If you touch this plant, it puts a chemical on your skin worse than poison ivy because it makes your skin sensitive to the sun. You get extreme sunburns with blisters, etc. And that sensitivity can last for years. So it really does severe damage. The solution, if you see this one, is you call the DEC. And they'll send in a crew and they'll put on full bunny suits. They'll get fully covered, and then they'll deal with it for you. So you really, I have never seen it. Hope I never do. But this is one. If you did see, it has these huge leaves. You can see a person wearing gloves holding it. You can see how much it's taller than this person. It's a giant plant. You just call the DEC. Just walk away. Don't try anything on your own. I've never seen it in a homeowner's lawn. I don't know any cases of it being. I've heard of it being out in the wild in parts of the Finger Lakes, but so hopefully none of you will experience that one. So let's now turn to plants that you may have in your garden deliberately. Plants that were certainly legal to sell before the regulations came into effect, that are often very common in home landscapes. So just looking at this list, things like burning bush or Japanese barberry, or Norway maples, or this tiny silvergrass, or honeysuckles. Some of these. Even look at this site. I would bet at least one person here has one of these in their yard, because they're all very common. So that produces the first reaction is, okay, I have these plants in my garden. What should I do? So the first thing I want to say is you are not required to do anything. What the regulations say is existing populations don't require management by the owner. So, nobody's going to come and cite you from the DEC. No one's going to come from the DEC and say, we're going to send in a bulldozer next week and dig that tree out. You can leave it forever if you want to. You can't propagate it. So you can't take cuttings to give to a friend. You can't propagate it or spread it further, but you're not required to do any removal. So what I'll recommend that you consider replacing it, when you're refreshing landscaping or whatever, and I'll give recommended replacements for all these, including when possible native plants. But it's not like you have to go to your yard this summer and take out every invasive you have. But you might just want to think about slowly trying to get rid of everything that is there. So let's start with all those bush honeysuckles. They were certainly all introduced here in the 1800s as ornamentals. My neighbor had one next to me. Nature took care of it. It fell over this winter, so it got old and fell over, so it's gonna be gone. But they have those little red berries that the birds love. Those berries are definitely nothing but sugar water, but the birds love them because they're sugar water. That's why they get dispersed. That's why it's a problem in the wild. The birds eat those berries, drop the seeds in the wild, and they get all over. So again, when it gets in the wild, it displaces natives and does all the bad things. It's a bush. So in the home landscape, saw it off at the base, you're done with it. There's lovely natives to replace it with. Buttonbush or white meadowsweet or red osier dogwood. Beautyberry is not native, but it's well behaved. So there certainly are lots of lovely bushes you could replace it with that would still give you a beautiful ornamental bush in your property. And then the invasive honeysuckle would no longer be putting seeds out into the wild in all the parks and everything. Autumn olive was introduced from Asia in the 1830s. It was promoted in the 1950s for erosion control. Again, this one produces berries that the birds spread that goes all over. This one, I would say almost every week when we're at Durand, we're clearing some autumn olive. And our standing instruction from the park manager is anytime you see it, cut it. But we could spend every day doing that because it seeds so prolifically that it is all over the park. It's all over most of our parks. This is another one you find along the Erie Canal. It spreads like crazy and has these bushes. It's an attractive bush, but it's taking over the native environment. This one had a score of 94 on that 0 to 100 scale to give you, so this is one of the highest scoring invasives on the state list. Again, there's tons of great native bushes or things you could replace it with. Serviceberry, which is a lovely native, Eastern Bacchus, the Northern Bayberry, or American smoke tree is not native, but so it'd be easy to find a bush, probably for sale here at Country Max later, but it'd be easier to find nice bushes to replace this with if you wanted to take it out. Border privet, again, native to Asia, was introduced to U.S. Forms dense thickets, so it was a nice hedge plant for yards and agriculture and things. Again, for the home gardener, you're just going to cut it off. Just a bush, you'll cut it off and be fine. There's great native replacements like chokeberry or arborvitae. or non-natives like boxwood or holly or yew. So there's lots of lovely plants you could put in, take the place of border privet and get that. Yes, yes. This one. Yeah, that's problem with common names. Yeah, common names, you can have many different privets. This particular privet, which it's not as pretty as a lot of the nicer privets that are okay. This one gets quite large. It's not the little low privet that some people have. It only grows like this tall. This one will be taller than me. Garden loosestrife is a close cousin to purple loosestrife, except it's yellow. It was native to Europe, introduced in the early 1900s. So it's a similar threat to purple loosestrife. It takes over and squeezes out native plants and native vegetation. This is a low perennial, growing about this tall, yellow flowers. You could replace it with, hundreds of other perennials. I put 5 up here, but you could use many, many other perennials to replace it. That would not be a problem. You can basically, whatever you'd like, I would just get the yellow loosestrife out of your garden. Japanese barberry is probably one of the most likely ones that someone in this audience has, because it was a really common landscape plant. It came from Asia, was introduced in 1875. It's been a popular garden plant ever since. My previous house had some Japanese barberry growing around a dogwood. It's just a very, very common landscaping shrub. It self-seed, it's great. The flowers that it produces are very inconspicuous, and the seeds are inconspicuous. So you may not even notice the flowers, but the birds have. And the birds spread the seeds all over the place. We were clearing along the Seaway Trail at Duran last week, and there was a huge stand of barberry next to the Seaway Trail. It gets in the park all the time. Again, it's another one that we like to do in the winter, not the spring, because of all the barbs on the barberry. And if you ever tried to pull weeds underneath it or whatever, you almost are guaranteed to get something stuck on your finger along the way. So this forms dense stands in the woods and things. If I was going to tell you something to take out first in your yard, I would say take this one out first, because there's a correlation. Areas with lots of barberry have more Lyme disease. And the correlation here is when the female tick lays her eggs in the fall and a nymph first hatches in the spring, the first nymph is really, really tiny down in the leaf litter. It can't get on a deer. That first nymph gets on a mouse or a vole or some little small animal. And it's the later stage nymphs that get on the deer and then later get on us. Well, if you're a little mouse or a vole, living underneath a barberry is a great existence, because foxes and coyotes and other things can't get their noses in there, because those same barbs that get us make it a very unattractive thing for a fox or vole or something hunting for the mice. So basically, areas of barberry have more mice and voles. More mice and voles means more habitat for the first generation Lyme disease ticks. So areas with more barberry have more Lyme disease. So if I was going to take something out of my yard first, I mean, a single bush is not big habitat for a mouse, but still, if I was going to take something out of my yard first, I would take out the barberry, because it really, it's highly invasive. It's creating tick habitat, not a great thing. And there are so many, again, this is a bush. By the way, it tends to have fairly shallow roots. So if you put on some good gloves and get your shovel out, even if it's been there for a number of years, you'll probably get it up at the roots fairly easily and have a place to put some new bushes. So things like ninebark or spicebush or cinquefoil or fragrant sumac are all lovely native plants that could take its place. Smokebush or Vigelia, non-native, but they're still nice. So there's lots of lovely bushes that take the place of barberry. But in terms of dealing with producing Lyme disease and tick habitat, it's a great move. Now, if you really have to have a barberry, there are 4 cultivars that are sterile that the state will legally allow nurseries to sell. So if you're out at a nursery and see them selling barberry, it's probably they're not breaking the law. It's probably one of these 4. So if somebody really has to have a barberry, there are some sterile cultivars that it is legal to sell. Japanese honeysuckle is a vine introduced in 1806. It climbs trees and can cause vegetation problems, just like I'll think of it in a minute. The other tree color I was talking about that I'm blanking on right now. I did a site assessment one time where somebody had this growing next to their garage and had taken over the entire garage. Oriental Bittersweet's the one I'm forgetting. But like Oriental Bittersweet, this one can kill trees. So I would take out the Japanese honeysuckle, replace it with our native trumpet honeysuckle or Dutchman's pipe or American bittersweet. If you want a lovely vine to climb a trellis or whatever, there are nice natives that would take the place of an invasive vine instead. Yellow flag iris, it was introduced in the 1700s, so this has been around for a long, long time. This goes into wetlands. This is not the typical iris growing in your garden. This is something that most irises are fine. If you yellow flag iris, it'll have the yellow flowers. It probably won't grow in the dry soil in your garden. It's probably more of a wetland plant. So you probably don't have this any place in your garden unless you've got a wet area. But it displaces, so some people have it in their wetland garden or their pond garden. When it gets into a wetland, it displaces all the native vegetation. Not quite as bad as Phragmites, but still doing a lot. Mechanical removal works for this with the caution of wearing gloves because the sap is irritating to the skin. So if you have a wet area with this, you might want to get it out. But this is not one of your nice garden irises. So those are just fine. Sycamore and Norway maples were a very popular landscape tree. There's a variety of the Norway maple called Crimson King that has that kind of red-green foliage that you see in a lot of yards. It spreads aggressively and puts out a lot of seeds, displacing our native vegetation. There's a corner of Highland Park, which is almost fully native maples, or Norway maples right now, having displaced the natives that were in that little corner of the park. Home removal is, well, it's easy that it's a single tree, you can cut it down. But if you got one that's 80, 100 feet tall, that gets expensive to remove. So this is where this might be the last invasive you take out of a yard, just because if it's a big, if it is your big major shade tree, you probably don't want to get rid of it. So this may be one that might be the last you take out. Also, the cost of taking out a huge tree is pretty expensive. But you could replace it with one of our native maples or a linden, a basswood, London plane tree. There's lots of lovely trees you could replace it with. But I'll admit that if you got one of these as a giant specimen in your yard, pretty hard to take out. Burning bush is the other one that probably at least several people's audience probably have, because it was a go-to plant for landscaping throughout the 80s and even the 90s. Burning, because it has the lovely red foliage in the fall. Everybody loved having burning bush. It was introduced from Asia, very popular landscape plant. Again, the flowers are really inconspicuous and the seeds are inconspicuous, where you may not have even noticed the flowers. Again, the birds have. I could show you areas at Durand Eastman Park where burning bush has taken over all the native vegetation. You're walking along a trail and there's nothing but burning bush next to you. So it really displaces things badly. This is probably, after I took out the Barberry, I'd probably take this one out next, because just because of how invasive it is and how much it does in the wild. Again, it's easy. There's chokeberries and dogwoods and viburnums and all sorts of things. There's lots of nice bushes you could replace it with that still have some, they may not be as red in the fall, but still have some nice fall foliage and are still very attractive. Black locust is another example of one that didn't move very far. This is native to the southeastern US. So this is not brought in from someplace far away. It's just native to the southeastern US. Behaves very invasively here. You get the main tree and then it keeps root sprouting. So you get a single tree and a bunch of root sprouts, and pretty soon you have a huge clump of trees. So from the home landscape, it's pretty easy. In the wild, when we hit this at Durand, you don't have one tree, you've got a whole set of trees, and if you cut them all down, they'll just root sprout. You can come back next year and do it again because they'll just keep root sprouting back up. So easily removed from the home landscape. There's lots of great natives you can replace it with. So this is one you can get out fairly easily. Chinese silvergrass, Macranthus, Morning Light was a really popular cultivar of this silvergrass. It was introduced in Asia in the 1940s. It's a very popular ornamental grass. It's probably not a problem here. This is probably only a problem in Long Island. It's definitely a problem in Long Island. It was escaping into the wild, spreading into ecosystems there, causing trouble. So it's banned statewide. But if you have miscanthus, you have a Morning Light or other beautiful miscanthus that you bought some years ago in your garden, it's not a super rush to get it out because it's not causing problems up here. But we have lots of beautiful native grasses that you could replace it with. So if you want to get it out and go native, there are lots of lovely things you can put in its place. And again, there are two sterile cultivars. If you really have to have this Macranthus, there are 2 sterile cultivars that nurseries can still sell because they don't cause any problems. Okay, let's talk about some plants that aren't on the official list but cause a lot of problems. We'll start with the tree of heaven, which actually our Finger Lakes prism does list as being invasive here in the Finger Lakes. It just hasn't made the state list yet. This one you'll find growing all along highways and things. I see it along the Keeler Street Expressway all the time. You'll notice it more in late summer, early fall, when the red seed pods kind of look like a red hand draping over the foliage. And so you'll see it all along freeways and other areas, sometimes in our parks. It is aggressively invasive in our area. And mechanical removal often fails because you cut it off and it just root sprouts. So you may have to use herbicides. The Finger Lakes prism's comment is removal may take years. And you may cut it and deal with root sprouts, and it may take you several years before it finally stops coming back. This is a hard one. Tree of heaven, because it's kind of the foliage looks a little like sumac. So if you see something sumac-like, but instead of in a typical sumac flower, the red flower kind of hangs over the foliage like this, you're looking at tree of heaven. So that's a challenge. And then there are a bunch of plants that are on Pennsylvania's invasive species list. So these plants are all, you can't sell these plants in the state of Pennsylvania. So if you think about climate change or whatever, they're likely to become a problem here. So I'm not going to talk about I'll talk about them because they're likely, if they're causing problems in Pennsylvania, probably only a matter of time before they're causing problems here. And some, I would argue, already are. Bishop's weed, sometimes called snow on the mountain, sometimes called goutweed. I see a victim back there. This is sold as a ground cover. And the claim sometimes is that the variegated variety is less aggressive, but the variegated variety often reverts to the, I see you nodding, often reverts to the non-variegated, spreads extremely aggressively, will squeeze out, instead of being a ground cover, will squeeze out everything in the garden instead. I did a site assessment one time where they showed us a garden bed. It was all bishop's weed. The gardener had some health problems where she hadn't been able to get to her garden the previous summer. She said, I had some nice perennials in here, and we couldn't find anything. We couldn't find anything except the goutweed or whatever you want to call it. The only way I know of control, this is another one, you leave a single piece of root behind, it'll be back. You could do herbicides, or you could simply sheet mulch an entire bed with cardboard and mulch and things and just leave it for a year and hope that in that year it all finally dies, it smothers and dies. But this one's it's a tough one to control.
I do have a full garden.
Mm-hmm.
Snow on the mountain started, so I dug out all of them. And I must have missed it.
Yeah, I mean, you miss something. You miss something that's wrong. It'll be bad. Yeah, so that's a bad one. English ivy, you see a lot around here as a ground cover. You see it climbing trees, and it may look lovely going up the tree, but the weight and the thing is that it's adding to the branches. Think of all the windstorms and things we had this winter. You don't want that extra weight in your tree branches. It's a good way to lose a tree. And so I would say that one's really is already a problem. When you see it going up trees and covering ground cover, it's very aggressive. Bradford pear was another extremely popular landscape plant tree. Small tree, doesn't get too big, lovely flowers in the spring, although some people think it smells awful. But it self-seeds like crazy. The birds pick off the little tiny fruit and drop the seeds, and becomes a problem in wild areas. So in Pennsylvania, it got bad enough that they put it on the banned invasive list. Butterfly bush. I will admit, if you want to start a fight amongst a group of gardeners, suggest that butterfly bush be banned, and half the group will say yeah, and half the group will come diving for you, because it does attract lots of butterflies. I mean, I would definitely concede that butterfly bush will attract lots of butterflies. The spiky flowers on butterfly bush really bring them in. But if you ever grow one in your garden, they self-seed like crazy. Yeah, you're another person nodding in the back. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, so the problem is it self-seeds. And so in Pennsylvania, it's self-seeding badly enough in the wild that they put it on their prohibited list and you can't sell it in the state anymore. Now, there are some sterile cultivars, but I don't know a lot about them. My concern is when they're sterile, does it also mean there's no pollen and nectar, which is often how, and then at that point, while you're growing it, there's no pollen and nectar for the butterflies anymore. Now, if it's just sterile because the seed is sterile but still has pollen and nectar, that might work. But so it has a lot of fans, but certainly in Pennsylvania, it's been banned. Common periwinkle is another one of those ground covers that just goes crazy and takes over the world, like the goutweed or whatever. Lily of the Valley, anyone who's ever grown Lily of the Valley knows that it's very aggressive. Another one that'll take over whole garden beds. And Chinese wisteria is just another one of those vines that if the weather gets warmer, it gets too aggressive and self-seeds and causes problems. So those are all plants not on our list yet, but if there's a second generation of the list produced at some point, I wouldn't be surprised if some of them move on. So if you want to get more information on the plants, the DEC publishes a really nice blue brochure that has a picture of every single plant. I couldn't talk about all of them, obviously, so all the plants on the list are here. If you simply Google, as I said, like New York DEC invasive plants, you'll get a link to this as a PDF and you can download it or whatever. And then Cornell has a list of our alternative plants. So all the alternatives I showed you tonight came from Cornell's list. So if you Google Cornell invasive plant alternatives, you'll get to their website where for every single invasive plant, they say, why don't you try growing this instead? And finally, of course, we provide resources, Cornell Cooperative Extension in Monroe County, our website, where we glad to answer. You can get information from our website. Our helpline starting this month is open 5 days a week. You can call them in the morning and talk to somebody live. You can leave a voicemail whenever you want. You can also send us emails via our website. You can email our helpline via the website. They'll email you back. I'll be glad to provide free advice on any garden question, invasive or otherwise. Other than that, we've got about 10 minutes before the hour is up. So I'll be glad to take any questions that anybody has. Yes. Yeah.
What is there a specific brand?
I can't off the top of my head. I would go to I would say I would give our helpline a call. They can probably pull up a fact sheet for you. The technique I'd be almost tempted to use it if the garden is really like all of that plant. We did this at Tinker Park, and I was surprised how effectively we were dealing with bindweed and several other invasives in some gardens at Tinker we wanted to renew. And so in the late summer, we ripped off what we could with a hoe, and we put down a layer of cardboard, and then a layer of compost, and then another layer of cardboard, and then a layer of mulch. And so I think it's called the lasagna mulching method or something, but it's just a series of layers. And then we just left it all winter. And the next spring, of course, the cardboard is degraded. We just punched holes in it where we wanted to put our new plants. And I was really impressed. All last summer, I weeded that bed every other week. And it took me about 15 minutes to weed the whole bed. The sheet mulching had really done a really effective job of knocking those plants out. So I'd be tempted, if you could forego gardening in a bed this year, even as early as now, putting down just, get some old cardboard boxes, so, do the layer type of thing, and just leave it for a year and let everything kind of cook and die underneath those layers of mulch. And then by next spring, the soil will be super rich from the compost and stuff. And hopefully that stuff will be under control rather, because at least when we did it, I was a little skeptical when we were doing a Tinker, like how well it would work. But when I weeded that bed last summer, it was like, 15 minutes and done, just a few weeds here and there. I was like, this is really, it worked really much better than I thought it would. Other questions?
I think we have a fair amount of invasive species. Yeah, we have our garden, we have
Yeah.
like the Oriental Bittersweet, we go and like you said, just cut down.
Yeah.
And is that a way?
Cutting it works. Yeah. I mean, if a lot. No, cutting it usually works when it's small. But yeah, I think you'll also find when it is small, it's surprisingly shallow rooted. If it's still if it's still smaller than my little finger, I'll typically try and pull it up. And a lot of times It comes up surprisingly easy. It's a bright orange root. So as you pull it up, it really is quite obvious that you're playing with the root is like a bright orange. But yeah, cutting will work, certainly. But if it's small, I might try just giving it a yank to see if it's going to come, because I found that as long as it's still fairly small, the roots typically are fairly shallow. Now, yeah. Now the ones I find at Duran that are this big around, yeah, I mean in that case all we do is I saw it a piece. I created like a 4-inch air gap and then just leave it, because when it's that big, I'm not going to try digging the root. I'll just cut a piece out of it. I mean, our technique, because we're working in the park, is we typically cut it low and high so that when I'm walking on the trail and I'm looking for it, I can see the gap. And so if you got a big woods in the back, you might think about just cutting it low and high, so when you're walking around your woods, you can see the dangling end, so you don't go over to cut it a second time. You don't get fooled and go looking to cut it a second time. The two cut method's kind of nice, because that way it's cut, and when you're walking around your property, you can see the dangling end to know that you've done the job already.
There's been like a lot of, we have ash trees that died. So
Yeah.
it changed the
Yeah.
atmosphere. So there's cherries. There's stuff
Oh,
like
that's
that
nice.
there. That's good, but it's good that some of these other.
Yeah, our biggest here when we joke at Duran when we cut out the autumn olive, we're creating great swallowwort habitat, because we cut out the autumn olive, the area becomes sunny, and then all the swallowwort seeds germinate. We got a whole hillside covered in swallowwort or something. So yeah, as you've created sun, I'd watch for invasive perennials like swallowwort and stuff, because now you've got sunny habitat, and the seeds they got deposited over time, they've got sun now. They'll all start good stuff like your cherries and hickories may come up, but a lot of bad invasives will say, oh, a nice sunny spot. Garlic mustard be another one. Create a sunny spot, the garlic mustard will come up. Yeah. So I mean I'm glad to hear you guys. Yeah. Well, when there's disturbance like the ash trees dying, that is a problem. That one of the first when you get this new sunny opening, one of the first things that'll pop up are all the invasives that have been sitting there in the seed bank kind of waiting, because there were probably birds and stuff sitting in those ash trees raining down seeds for years, and now the seeds have sun. So you're right, you probably have garlic mustard, swallowwort, various things coming up. Yeah.
Is there a rating, not an inventory maybe, but a rating system for the urgency in some of these? Go after garlic mustard first, get it rid, and then move on to something else.
I would, I guess I like going after garlic mustard, because if it's a confined area, you can actually win, because you can get it, because if you pull it, but it comes out by the roots, and you don't have to worry about leaving a root behind. I just like it for the satisfaction of it's a win. So like the swallowwort and the other ones are hard, but it's nice to have an easy win where you get something out and say, okay, I got that one. But I mean they're all bad, but it's nice to have one easy victory while you fight all the tough ones.
I've been told by a couple of people they call it Russian olive. Is that a nickname?
No, Russian olive is a different ornamental olive, and I don't think it's on the invasive list. You could check, but I think Russian olive is more of it's not native, but I don't think it's badly behaved. I think it's autumn olive is the one that's really the one that's a problem. You could double check the state list, but I don't think Russian is a troublesome one. I think that one might be okay. Yeah. I'll flip through the brochure after the talk here before you leave. We can flip through the brochure and see if I'm wrong, but I don't. Because I think if it had been bad, I would have thrown it as one of the ones in the. If it was bad and common, I would have thrown it at the end of the talk. Yeah. Creeping Charlie is an annoying lawn weed, but it's not on the list, because it's typically only a problem for people who want perfectly pristine lawns, and it's a problem, but it hasn't been causing problems in the wild. So yeah, you could call our helpline our helpline gets a lot of calls for Creeping Charlie, and I know they have a fact sheet on it, because that's one of the annoying weeds around here. Not invasive, but yeah, it's a weed we get a lot of calls about. Any other questions? Otherwise, thank you all for coming.